Welcome to Leadership and the Tarot. My name's Nicole. I'll be your guide on this journey. I'm so glad you've joined us. Let's jump in. Welcome, friends. So glad to be here today. We'll go ahead and jump into our card and the book that was inspired by the card, but it all feels so aligned today as we are filming it. It is Monday, lunes, lunar, so a day around the moon. It is a full moon on January 17th, 2022. It is also a day in the United States when we are celebrating, honoring the life and contributions of Martin Luther King Jr. and the ways in which we can continue to live out that dream and that work that individual and those around them really stood up for and inspired a nation into thinking about what does it really mean to create a just world in which we can all thrive and experience liberation. So a very beautiful day, felt like a very auspicious day and very aligned to the card that we pulled that came from last week. And inspired the reading that I was doing. So let's go ahead and just jump in there. So the card that I pulled this week was the moon. And the moon is a very complex card. The moon is just a very complex, beautiful item that we see in the sky. And it carries so much messaging and invitations for us. And so as I pulled the card, I was like, oh my goodness, what book really is calling me into answering this message, into going deeper into the messaging of the moon? And I was inspired to read Sacred Instructions. The whole title is Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. So while this isn't what we might consider a traditional leadership or business book, I think it's so much more than that, because it is connecting this concept of the way that we live our lives influences how we lead and how we run business and what we value in our life. So I would argue that it actually is a leadership business book, and that if you are looking for a way to start to integrate Indigenous wisdom into your life and into your work, this could be a great jumping off point in understanding what are some of the principles, what are some of the ways, the actual ways that you can tap into ancestral Indigenous wisdom and bring that out into the way in which you move through the world and inspire others to do so as well. So again, Sacred Instructions is the book that I jumped into and was inspired by the moon, and we'll go a little bit deeper into some of the messaging as we move through the moon and the invitation it brings us into this week, but we'll get there. So the book, the card for the day, like I said, is the moon. So let's go ahead and see if we can get it. There is the moon there. There are two creatures, a wolf and a dog, a lobster, and a pool of wisdom, the moon. For me, as I think about the moon and what it calls me into and really being mindful of, and that I would like to bring forth into this space, is how are we making space as leaders for intuitive leading and heart-based leading, slowing down our work. And it is in the book of Sacred Instructions, there is a call into making space for feminine leadership. And the moon is often connected to the divine feminine. And so my call here today, my invitation is to, what does it mean to call in and to make space for feminine leadership in our organizations, in our work, and why is it so important? And when I say feminine leadership, I don't necessarily just mean women. I mean an approach to leadership that is rooted in feeling, is rooted in sitting and looking at a challenge and making sure we're looking at it from all the aspects before we move forward and take action. So I do think it's very important that we have women sitting at our leadership tables. And I will also say that just because you have women sitting at your leadership table does not mean that there is space for feminine leadership. I have seen many women actually prescribe to a much more masculine way of leading. And there's probably a variety of reasons why, but I'm going to talk just about a few of them. Is that many of us have been socialized to believe that to be able to sit at leadership tables, to be heard, to be valued, we need to behave in a more masculine, action-driven, no feelings, moving forward kind of way. And we've been rewarded for it, and that's how you're heard. And so what I'm asking for here is, when we're talking about feminine leadership, and it could come from anyone, there are probably, all of us have divine feminine inside of us. Doesn't matter your gender identity, you have a connection to the divine feminine, you have a connection to the moon. So how are we understanding that just because we have women at the table does not necessarily mean we are making space for feminine leadership, for leadership that really is rooted in intuition and feeling and understanding these components. And that goes for all types of equity work. When we are thinking about bringing people to the table because someone's telling us we need more diversity in our leadership, we need more diversity in our organization, how are we making sure that we're actually making space for another way of being, rather just than maintaining the status quo and bringing people in to follow suit, to keep it going as it is and make sure they assimilate into the ways that we are behaving. That way we can keep going. I think it's a really important challenge to be called into, and one of the challenges in that, and it goes back to many of the cards that we've been invited to before, which is you have to listen. Because if your way of being is so ingrained in how you've been socialized and what you've been taught, you probably won't know if you're creating an open space, a space that honors the diverse perspectives and ways of being of different groups. So if you want to do that, you probably have to ask, how do I create this type of environment? And ask a lot and do a lot of listening, because as I said, just because you bring a woman on into your leadership table, that doesn't necessarily she understands what feminine leadership looks like if she herself has been participating in these systems for a long time. So even going into a book like Sacred Instructions that goes back into how women supported the leadership in tribes and what their role was, can start to open dialogue around what is it that we need in our at our leadership table to really be inclusive and to actually include the voices that we need to hear, and then how do we integrate that into how we are together. So to me, the moon really is an invitation into embracing feminine leadership in our organizations. And it's interesting when you look at the moon, the two animals there are a dog and a wolf. And it's this piece of balancing the tame side of us as well as the wild side of us. And I think that, again, as a woman, that really resonates, of like the pieces of me that have been tamed and then the pieces of me that are still so wild. And how do I balance that out and bring that forth, rather than only tending to the tame sides of me. Also, with the moon, it invites us into cycles. How are you creating cycles in your work? And this isn't necessarily about the feminine side, but I do think, right, when we talk about women and cycles, it really is very deeply related. And so cycles in our work, there's two pieces in that I think are really beautiful to think about. One is setting intentions. The new moon is about how do you set intentions? What's going to be important? We might even talk about that in our work as what are your goals for this cycle? And then the full moon is the time in which we are celebrating. How are we making space to celebrate and honor the work that you've done? And really holding that as an important part of the work that you do, that it's not just about starting new cycles again and again or starting new projects again and again. You must complete the cycle in that way of let us make space to honor and celebrate what has been done. I think too often we just keep on taking new project after new project and we forget to celebrate what has happened along the way. So purposefully integrating cycles into your work. And I think in particular in coaching, in my coaching work, do 6-week cycles with people. One, because it tends to give us enough time to unpack something, to really set an intention. What do we want to work on? And then focus in on that work. And then at the end of that 6 weeks, take a moment to celebrate what has happened in that time. Maybe there was an initial intention of that this goal was going to end up in this way, but at the end of that 6 weeks, something different, something more miraculous happened. Or maybe even something very unexpected came up along the way. And how are we making space just to honor that and then move into our next cycle? And it's not that we have to choose a different topic for that next cycle. Maybe what came up is now we have a new level of coaching that we can jump into here. Or maybe it's saying, yeah, that really did come to an ending. That cycle really did feel complete. I would like to move into something else in my professional work. So including cycles also in your meeting spaces. How are you creating cycles in how your meetings what are the intentions of the meetings that you're creating, making that space to set the intention with the group, going through the work, and then making a place in there to pause, to sort of end that cycle and say, how was this as we focused on this? What's working well? What do we want to continue forward in our meeting spaces? And what do we want to let go of? Or does this meeting space need to continue at all? And by making cycles a regular part of our work, what it does is it allows us to really be reflective on what's meaningful and what can we release and let go of and start a new cycle. Cycles are all over nature. So I think as we think about how our workspaces can be mirroring some of these things happen in nature, we become more connected to the work as well. One last part of the moon, it can also be about unhealed trauma, and that things are coming up for you that weren't tended to, and that they continue to repeat themselves in your life, and is an invitation to make space for healing that trauma. And again, I'm going to go back to the value of feminine leadership that, again, does not have to be held by someone who has an identity as a woman. Feminine leadership can be held by anyone who's willing to make space for this. But for us to be able to make space to support people in healing their trauma, we have to make space in our work for feelings, for slowing down, for honoring how people are coming into spaces, and then making sure that people feel heard and valued so that we're not continuing to activate or trigger people in this work because we're not understanding. We're not slowing it down enough to understand. So how are you making an intentional space, I'll use that word again, or an intentional movement towards honoring our divine feminine, honoring our intuition, honoring our feelings? And what does that look like within your organization? How are you doing that right now? How do people feel about their ability to slow things down, to share their feelings, to really take some time to make sure we're gathering all of the right information before we make a decision? And that will let us know, how are we doing at making space for this feminine leadership? And if what we hear is that's that's not happening here. That I don't feel safe to do that. I don't feel safe to ask for that. Just adding women to our workplace is not going to change things. It's adding women and then changing the culture. It's saying, okay, we need to add women, and we need to think about what's happening in our organization, what sort of artifacts, what sort of practices do we have here that would make space, that would really support us in slowing down, making sure we're tending to our emotions, making sure we're gathering enough information, making sure that we're not just acting quickly because we feel like we need to get something done. Well, thank you, friends, for joining today. I was really excited about this card and this book, and it really called to me, and I was excited to be able to share that with you all on this very auspicious, beautiful full moon day. So I hope you all have a beautiful week, and if you have any comments or would like to add some dialogue to this space, please go ahead and drop something down in the comments. I would love to hear what you have to say. And if there's any topics that you're intrigued by, or if you're reading any great books and would like to recommend them to me and to the community, that would be fantastic. So thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.